Welcome everyone to the Academy for Teachers mini masterclass with Karen Russell. This is a very difficult moment for everyone. When sorrows come, they come not single spies, but in battalions. And the battalions are coming at us from all sides these days. But it's important to concentrate on the joys that we have in life. And Karen Russell is one of life's great joys. And so it's my pleasure to introduce her to you. You're going to love being with her for the next hour. You'll be discussing the stories that she assigned, and then after that's over, you'll be given a writing assignment to do, and then we will be sharing those with each other on Thursday afternoon. Karen, you all know, everyone knows that Karen was a Pulitzer finalist for Swamplandia. She has wonderful short stories. She's much heralded. I don't know, where are all your garlands, Karen? Did you bring them with you to show off all your awards?
I showered. I wore this like decently clean thing.
Okay, good.
It's a big
All right.
event.
Thanks for doing this, Carol. Have fun
I'm
with these
so happy
wonderful
to see you
pictures.
guys. Um, I was just reading about how sales of tops, sales of bottoms have sort of flatlined, but sales of blouses are just, through the roof. So I feel like, um, and I want to just say I get a little shy. I never, I want to make eye contact with you guys, but it just feels a little like being fireflies in a jar. So it's hard to maybe, Renee, when we kind of open things up to discussion, if I'm missing somebody or if there's a hand up, just jump in. Um, or you like passive aggressively unmute yourself and make some Raya side and I'll snap too. Um, but for some reason, and forgive me, I just can't get the gallery view to work in my browser. So we're just gonna roll. And when you guys talk, I'll see you. And uh, yeah, if you can quietly mouth curse words or whatever. In the meantime, I won't know. Um,
Karen, yeah, I'm going to jump in here. If you want the gallery view, just click on the words in the top right corner of your screen. It should say
I know, I joined the meeting through my browser. Here, I don't. This is like that SNL sketch where they're like, Nana, unmute yourself, Nana. Um, I think this, and so that maybe this is a secret gift because I'll get to see Sam and I'll see you guys. Let me see. Um, but I got inspired to talk about the Decameron because the New York Times is doing a special issue where they ask some fiction writers to write something where the pandemic is in the background, our pandemic, right, the coronavirus. Meredith was just saying when we came up with this class, the coronavirus was sort of the main event, and now, of course, um, we're living through this convulsive, incredible, heartbreaking moment together. And I'm sure you guys in New York, I'm here in Portland, and it's just an amazing protest yesterday. So I know that's sort of on the forefront. And the Decameron is a good book for this time. And for those of you who aren't familiar, it's 100 stories. So I can't say that I'm an expert, and I'm aware that people do their dissertations on this topic. Um, and I was just sort of coming at it from a fiction writer's perspective. And I'll say that one of the things that seemed really exciting to me as a teacher also is that this is a book where you get a tapestry of human life. And it's a storytelling game. So there's something, you know, just in its framing, so fun about having a different storyteller every day come up with a prompt and then sharing these stories. What could be more human? Um, and if you had a chance to read the contextualizing article that went out sort of last minute, forgive me, last night, um, you know, we're all watching probably some of our friends in their personal Decamerons and the Hudson Valley or where have you. Um, these sort of young noble people. I have a friend of mine, very handsome millennial guy who did decamp from Brooklyn, to his parents' house, and I think they are just drinking wine and making music, and I presume I don't know, slow dancing in the woods. Uh, but what I loved about returning to this book and getting the assignment myself of coming up with a story inspired by the Decameron. If you look at the themes, the prompts, each day has a different one. Um, and the one that really called out to me was misadventures that end happily, which is what we read, Landolfo. Um, and I'll just read this. That very ordinariness of the time before plague became the object of his inquiry, filling many more pages than his short account of the Black Death. Um, the majority of the tales are about people of the merchant class, and the skill they most feature is the one most prized by that class: cleverness, wit, thinking on your feet. And it's sort of a promiscuous virtue. In some of the stories, in the one we read, right, there's a little bit of a more of a kind of a didactic or moralistic ending. This merchant, he becomes a pirate. He has more success there. He's, consumed by greed. He wants to double his wealth and sort of um, in there's like his version of the Odyssey. This old woman cares for him on the island of Corfu, and he discovers that the very chest that he was so afraid of, that seemed perilous in the beginning, that he's holding on to, contains these rubies. um, he's clothed, he's fed, he's cared for. He makes his way home. He makes restitution on his debts, and he decides at the end, you know what, I'm not going to be a venture capitalist any longer. I'm just going to content myself with um, with what I need, which is pretty radical. So um, some of the tales have that kind of virtuous and surprising happy ending. Many more of them, and I'm a shy person, so I didn't send around like the dirtiest ones. Um, feature sort of adulterous people who are never unpunished, and in fact, they often live happily despite their former inconstancy. Um, uh, I think one of kind of a perennial favorite from the Decameron is the story about Peronella, this woman who is rolling around with her lover. Her husband comes home. She tells her lover to hide in a barrel. And then she goes on the offensive and she lays into her dude for not having a job. And what has he been doing? Why is he coming home early? And he says, "Good news, I sold that barrel for 5 ducats." And she's like, "I have even better news. I sold it to a guy for 7 ducats, and the guy is inspecting the barrel right now." So there are a lot of these stories, of just sort of wit winning the day, and some have called this book pretty amoral, and it feels like a just a joyful, raucous body celebration of human ingenuity. And also at the same time, this is sort of the collision of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. So um, there's sort of a proto-capitalist critique embedded inside it, and an awareness of this world that is becoming global. Trade is weaving people's fates together, and I think that was something that was mentioned in the article I sent around. Just sort of the points of contact for us reading it today in 2020. What does it mean to be a globally interdependent society? What we're living in this time of accelerated connectivity, and I think that this has been the virus is shining its light on all kinds of suffering and inequity, but also maybe on how profoundly mutable this world is. So it seemed nice to pair these stories with Severance and Millhauser's tale. And I don't want to keep yammering and yammering, but I will say that thinking about them together and thinking about them as a fiction writer, I've had a really hard time writing these days. I feel like I've just a water beetle skittering on the surface of things. And it was nice to return to each of these and see, wait, so one is a complete celebration of the best and the worst of human nature. And I think the best stories in the Decameron, uh, you know, Joan Acosella says they elevate real people. The noble women are, the tellers of these tales, and the three noble dudes, but it's the proles who give it its vitality, she says. So looking at sort of like looking with depth and complexity at, as unlikely as some of these happy endings are, there's a real care paid to just sort of the everyday details of these people's lives. What does it look like if you're a wine, if you're selling wine, if you're loading it on this ship, having these kinds of beautifully observed details. Um, in Severance, and also in the Invasion from Outer Space, there's this also a kind of like a critique of what capitalism does to people and what greed in our society, the accumulation, what that can look like. And I thought maybe we could start there, with just points of connection between these texts. There may be sort of surprising correspondences between this book written during the Black Plague in a world of poetry and music on the periphery of the plague, and a speculative tale written in 2009 about a pollen from outer space that consumes cars and houses and life as we know it, and Ling Ma's 2018 novel about the Shen fever. So just any sort of surprising correspondences between those.
This is where we count to 8. I think you have to count to give people time.
I'm just going to call on Sam.
Well, I was gonna say, I mean, I think like the loop we were all thrown for is, because we're all like Mackenzie, you were saying earlier, like immersed in the news right now. It was so hard to read any of these without connecting it to something that's going on now. So like, I wasn't even thinking of the threads in between the three stories. I was just like everything. I mean, and I love, dystopian literature, and I'm all about it. And now I'm at that point where like the creator of Black Mirror, Charlie Brooker's like, I'm not doing season 6 because we're living in it right now. And it's been very interesting because I read Severance last year on vacation. I was like, enjoying myself and, just looking forward. And then all of a sudden you're reading it now and it's like this checklist. Oh yeah, we didn't do that. Oh, we did that. And so
Right.
I found this like, and I've also like joined the queue to read The Plague. Like you just now are reading these pieces of literature for the things that we missed or what did we not do. So that I see as a common thread in the sense that like it's very reflective. It's causing a reflection of like where we're at as a society, what we're doing correctly, what we're not, and how our governments are taking care of us. So those are all kind of like the thoughts that kept going through as I was reading them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with Ling Ma and Invasion from Outer Space also, they both sort of start out with this acknowledgement of a kind of deja vu that these characters are feeling, that comes from seeing the end of the world represented in art, cinema, books. And I also had that feeling, right, where it's like, oh, art has been our truest dress rehearsal for this moment, and you sort of see the failure of many institutions, and people are then sort of thrust back on. I read somewhere that everyone was renting Contagion, for example, right? So people are just desperate at this time. How do we manage uncertainty and consensus? And it turns out, I think the Decameron has seen a huge spike in interest because it's something that does sort of speak to this moment, and a moment of radical flux, right? Of a feeling that one order is maybe giving way to something new, which I think is for sure part of the idea of these noble people who are also grappling with like a mercantile class and this vastly enlarged world. Um, but yeah, I know that I read everything through the lens of the news now too. Um, I also loved, the Decameron, not this story that I sent around necessarily. I think it's funny, and the monkey is pretty funny. I think the idea, some of the conventions, where she has to keep saying, as commonly happens in these situations, the ship broke apart into a million pieces. And I mean, it's just, um, the sort of the deadpan way that some of these calamities are described, I found sort of funny. But with Ling Ma, when I was returning to it, I was so struck by the way she sets this tone. She's tacking so lightly between some really horrifying things, right? Um, Even before you hear anybody's name in this book, there's this sort of the we, and that's in the Millhauser too, right? This first person plural. And when the cue ball breaks and you're like, well, who is inside this we? We were brand strategists and property lawyers and human resources specialists and personal finance consultants. We didn't know how to do anything, so we Googled everything. We Googled how to survive in wild, which yielded images of poison ivy, venomous insects, and bear tracks. Um, I think what that does when she's establishing her authority, her storytelling authority right from the get-go, there's some beautiful earnest passages where she returns to Fanzu, to China, and you really, I think that book, the book takes absolutely seriously the specific longing of Candace Chen. But when it's in sort of this first person plural mode, you hear that sort of satirical, there's a kind of estrangement and there's permission to laugh, right? This isn't sort of a vertical spin into the mud. I mean, there's sort of a wry intelligence at work, from those first paragraphs. Um,
Scott, do you want to jump in with your comment or question? And I'm going to need to ask you to unmute yourself there, Scott.
Yes, it's just a quick comment. I just noticed that all three sort of have to do with helplessness, and your fate is not in your own hands. In the Decameron, it's kind of a happy kind of thing that's happening, just happy, but it's not in your own hands. And I found that really interesting that they all did that, had that as part of it. And I really like the Ling Ma. I actually bought that a couple of weeks ago, so it was perfect timing.
I'm glad. I loved that book, Scott. And that's, it's interesting. I was reading a little bit about the Wheel of Fortune, as not the game show we all loved. Remember when it just seemed like dinette sets were the best thing that could happen to you as an adult? This was my feeling watching the old Wheel of Fortune. But just this idea of like a preordained sort of transcendental order that starts to shift in the Renaissance, and then there's something chaotic but exciting, like maybe human agency and wiliness, and plays more of a role. So sort of thinking across text, like where what the humans have power over versus what there's something so implacable about this pollen falling, and you watch people's orientation towards this catastrophe change, but that the fact of it seems pretty immutable. Definitely. And,
Danielle,
yeah,
would you like to?
And also is sorry that he wouldn't necessarily say he deserves his reversals of fortune.
Yeah. Danielle, I'm wondering if you want to jump in next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, something I was struck by in all the readings was this question of there's confusion on why this had happened. So in all of the pieces, it's there's no understanding of why things are happening the way they are. So in the Decameron, he says either thanks to the benevolence of God or through the power of the wind. So not sure of why it's happening, but things are happening. And then in the Invasion from Outer Space, it says the feeling grows in us that we deserve something else. And I was really struck by the fact that we can't name why anything's happening, but whatever is happening, we feel like we deserve something else. And then that's kind of this common theme that's playing among the different stories. And I haven't read Severance, so just the first chapter is all I've been exposed to. But yeah, really, it struck me that this inability to name or identify, but still feeling like we deserve more, whatever it was that was making this happen.
Yeah, I was very sympathetic to that feeling in all of them, right? Or sort of that seems sort of universal. And there's comedy in it too, in the Millhauser, right? And in Landolfo, where it's that kind of total contingency, right? Or your best hopes colliding with this totally unjust circumstance.
And just in the commentary, the line, I said this to my small group, but plague arrived in his city not because the constellations had aligned badly, not because it was God's will, but as the inevitable consequence of a restless and consuming society ever on the move. And again, maybe that's naming it a little bit, but it's also just like the restlessness and constantly moving produces something. We don't know what it is, but it produces something.
Right.
Chris, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I'll lower my hand. Yeah, I want to echo what Scott was saying in that confronting of that which is beyond our control is really interesting. And I'm in teaching fiction workshops, I'm always pushing my writers to have the characters make choices that have consequences, so that something actually happens in the story. But I guess I'm really interested in these pieces and in my own writing right now. Like there's sort of two, like maybe the two big trends or two big ways of thinking about the self in literature, or Shakespearean or Greek. In the sense that like Shakespeare was getting us into a character, right? With the onion, we just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and learning more about the character. And this time, these pieces and this time in our country feels more like the Greeks, right? Like that we don't have gods anymore, but we have police, and we have a plague, and we have governmental systems of oppression and limited choice for characters. And I guess I'm really interested in that, and how you can handle it in writing in a way where we still feel engaged by a character and still feel like that character is making choices that we care about, but we're not lying about what power a character has over these systems that are unequal in their impact and terrible, right? Like have the potential to end lives, or potential to, here's double your money magically because you got the right trunk,
Right. Right. I mean, that is, I've always felt sort of allergic to underdog narratives for that reason, because it sort of celebrates, you know, sort of like, why wouldn't we want to make everything more equitable, instead of celebrating an individual who's somehow against all odds, why not change the odds? I think that's, and I think it's interesting to think about sort of a first person plural, that voice. I've been trying to write a story with a we that kind of fractures and splinters into individuals and then coheres again, because I do really feel like that's the rhythm of this moment. There's a sort of heaving collective polity, and then it's of course composed by all kinds of individual actors. So finding a way to be true about both. Yeah, in the real stakes. I think I was going to read you guys this. This is from an interview with the Paris Review. Ling Ma said that the animating question of Severance was, why does Candace Chen keep working at her job? Which I thought was sort of interesting at this particular moment where, we see how quickly life can be revised in some ways. And then there are these sort of the way that our days are structured, and kind of the crushing sameness of office work, which is what she's satirizing here and also, indicting, mourning. This is as the story continues, Candace, the population is decimated. Manhattan is totally emptied out. The only people left are these bodyguards hired by institutions to sort of protect their property. And then even they fall victim to this virus. And Candace, who has, mysterious immunity, it seems, she just keeps going to the office. And there's something darkly comic about that, right? Meredith was saying that she's been really aware of the ghosts of sounds, sort of the things that used to be in the background are now foregrounded as absence. So if you're used to hearing whatever, right, the whir of your computer, or, for you guys, just, human din in the hallways, how that's more present to people right now. And I think that sometimes with some of this, I think dystopian fiction can get a bad rap sometimes. I was talking with my mom about it. She's like, it's so grim. Like, I think she thinks that there's people relish it. It's like then the wolves run into Manhattan and, it's just like a bad CGI. And I was making the case to her that people are really interested in what changing the perspective reveals about this world that we live in. So, thinking about some of, if some of you guys have read David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, right? What's so funny to me about that first page is like, wait a second, let's pool our skill set and see how this post-apocalypse is going to go for us. And I think with the Millhauser too, sort of, this is, probably obvious to you guys, but I was reading it at a time when I was losing a relative to cancer. And I was also thinking about that proliferation, that blind proliferation, and how unjust it feels in the story. It wakes you up to sort of your, it seems so outrageous, right? That this single-celled organism is going to end life on our planet. And so just thinking about denial of death generally, right? And its warping effects. Because if you lose somebody to cancer, right, that's sort of, it is. It's sort of like there's a proliferation of a malignancy. It's not personal. It's just what's happening. So I think when we're talking about fate, what you can control, what you can't control, and what that reveals about the mystery of human nature. Are any of you guys writing your own fiction right now? Can I ask?
Yeah. Nicole, do you want to jump in? Yeah. Do you want to jump in with your question, Nicole?
Yeah. Gosh, so many things to say, but I'm going to try to condense it. I have a 3-month-old, and so my mind is always on like mom mind. So I really appreciate this opportunity, Karen, and the stories that you provided for us. And the last thing you just said about human nature really struck me, just because I was thinking as people were talking, Mina had said, you can't really separate your reading experience with what's going on. Literally, like outside my window, Manhattan is sinking. And I feel like just there's so much emotion that I feel when I'm reading these stories, and I can't quite articulate it as well as I can. But I think one thing that struck me was, from, I guess, a writer's perspective, and someone who like loves reading, the stories made me think about, what does disease and virus and quarantine reveal about human nature, right? Mm-hmm. And I think reading Decameron, I just felt really conflicted, to be honest. It's a story where I'm reading about a man who doesn't want to return poor, right? And he goes on this journey. But I think on the other hand, from just to like nerd out, because I love talking about writing and structure, I think all of these stories have some sort of beautiful narrative arc where we're looking at characters or narrators who are driven and pushed in some way, right? They have some sort of desire that they're going after, or something that they want to escape. So I did really appreciate that about all 3 stories, but it did leave me with an unsettling feeling after, especially reading Decameron. And I was just wondering what you make of that ending, especially in the context of this time. Because I know that on one hand, I do, like you, Karen, I really appreciate the fact that dystopian literature does offer us a different perspective. Just a side note, I use St. Lucy's every year with my 8th graders to discuss power, and the characters in that story just like beautifully reveal that. So just wanted to know everyone's thoughts about the ending of Decameron, especially in this time.
Does somebody not me want to jump in? Because I feel like I've been yakking a lot. That's a great question. Jay, Miguel?
So when you said the end of Decameron, you were speaking specifically the end of the story, the excerpt that we read, yes? Yeah. It's funny because I guess I was thinking so much about in the stories, when it came to the idea of power and like having it or not having it, it was always grounded in this like very ordinary moments where you would expect there to either be a great power or something to be intervening, right? In the beginning of the New Yorker piece, everyone's looking at the sky and expecting this dramatic, skeletal aliens to arrive. In the beginning of the Decameron, he sort of like thrust it into action, but it's meant to be sort of like, and this was obvious that this would be the next step that he would take. They're all supposed to be very ordinary moments that we're supposed to be deriving this great power or opportunity from. And I felt sort of like the power was still there, but we chose to see it as just ordinariness afterwards, right? Like, or a lot of the characters are seeing it as this like, oh, it's just pollen that's growing, and there's this continuous contradiction between like, it won't do anything to us, but it's actually eventually going to smother you and kill you, so it will do something in the long run. And in Decameron, it's like he goes from poor to rich and poor to rich, and this constant back and forth, but really often it depended on the perspective of the individual at the time.
I see Mina's got a hand up.
Yeah, kind of addressing, you guys touched on these things, but like the tone, I guess, of all three, I'm sensing this very like almost this detached tone. And Miguel, you were talking about like power, and I was seeing it not on the side of like, oh, there's fate having the power, but like the agency that the protagonists have in each. And it just seems like the Decameron like really surprised me, because I read that one first and I was like, oh, okay, so it's just a tale, and then it just kept going, and it like his misfortune kept coming, and I was like, oh wow, so it's going to be about a hapless man, and at the end, he ends up actually like prevailing, and yet none of those things seemed like, it wasn't like your typical hero's journey, right? It wasn't like, oh, I've come back. It's like these things kept happening to him. And I love that line from the Millhauser piece where it's, you quoted it already, Miguel, but this idea of like, we're waiting for buildings to be burning and cars exploding, and it's this very mundane, it's this toxic dust. And even in that, there's no malice. Like, and Karen, you already like referred to that line, but like it just merely wishes to replicate. And so like this thing that is destroying is like, it's just another life form. And perhaps if you were shifting perspective, write the story from the version of the toxic dust, and they're like, yeah, we just saw these things and we prevailed and we overcame, and now we populate this new earth. And so it is that matter of perspective. And I thought, with the going to work piece that you just said about Candace, like, and this idea of like, well, this is something I know, and like this detachment, it a little bit made me think of like The Road, like Cormac McCarthy. We do that one all the time for diction, and it's like the kids are like, oh, it's so simple to read, but it's like, no, like, like just this detachment, these things are happening and you're surviving, and that's a huge, like, that's a big deal that you're surviving, you're going through these things, and as we're reading about them so casually, but there is this like detachment. And so the power doesn't seem like it doesn't seem purposeful on the part of the protagonist, but if you think about it, especially in these times, I mean, going to the grocery store was like a moment of power for me. And it was like, that was my victory for the week. I went outside and I, wasn't afraid. So that the power in the mundane kind of spoke to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking a little bit while I was reading all of these stories. You guys have mentioned this, when you're living a story, groping along kind of paragraph to paragraph. I think because we have that estranged perspective on Landolfo, we're never in his head. Chris was right. This isn't this isn't like a psychologically realist tale where someone's really kind of like, we're not immersed in his sort of consciousness in that way. So there's and with Millhauser too, there's almost like a deliberate flattening, right? This is like every town, and the we, this communal voice doesn't really splinter into any specific personalities. And so I think from that vantage, you can really witness someone kind of groping along in the complete darkness, right? Unaware, like, is this chest going to kill him? Whatever you're gripping, whatever is booing you in that moment, completely mysterious to you in some way. So leaving aside like I really do think that's a through line with all of these tales, this idea of like what is grotesque about America also is kind of drama of accumulation. just this insatiable appetite for growth, and the disequilibrium that creates. I was thinking, we're living this moment together. This is a real story. And I think more than ever in my lifetime, I am so aware kind of day to day that in the vast we, all of our storylines have merged at this moment, and we're threatened, obviously incredibly unequally, but there's nobody whose life is untouched right now by, these overlapping crises. And so being aware of, the power of being in that authorial position, with all of it. Yeah, I think that is a let's see. I wrote something a little more articulate than this to read to you guys. Maybe I'll send it around via Renee, but just sort of that feeling of, when you're living a story, really groping along clause to clause, uncertain of where the paragraph break is going to be. And looking out at sort of some of these streets right now, and seeing the power of the collective. That feels new to me. And I was thinking, one of the prompts, you guys have choices, but one is to try to tell a story from the first person plural point of view. And thinking a little bit also about who composes that we. And it can be as small or as big as you want it. It can be 2 people, or it can be 2 million people. But sort of, I always think that's an interesting question for students too. Sort of, who are you writing about, and who are you writing this for? Who are you writing with and for? And some of the questions that have already come up, right? Sort of like, to what degree is the future malleable? Is a great question. I think just practically, what I love about the Millhauser, there's something amazing to me about a story this short. Something about the scale of what it takes on seems inversely proportional to the page count, and I get way in the weeds myself. I tend to spin out a lot as a writer. So sort of looking at the tops of his paragraphs and watching how masterfully he's moving it along. I feel like, just as like a sidebar, if I ever get stuck, I'll go into a draft and just read the very first sentence of every paragraph, and it should be moving, right? I think Chris was saying students kind of they write these things that are static, or it's like, wait a minute, I know what this story needs: a character and conflict of any kind. So sort of watching him, escalate, and watching sort of like what is revealed, because of this flattening. It's not really about one character's journey. It's just sort of, as a collective, how do we move through this time of incredible uncertainty, like history before it's conjugated, when there aren't any names, as somebody was mentioning. But I sort of did, I love, in terms of like a time that feels revisionary or sort of radically malleable. I'll send also around Joan Ecosella's piece. It talks about this, about how kind of destabilizing it was to sort of watch this old order pass away. And how one of Boccaccio's fears was that the future was going to get hijacked by people with no ethics, and driven exclusively by greed. And we're living in a moment where I think everyone is aware of how that has played out.
Caitlin, do you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, to piggyback right on that, the line from the story from the Decameron that I wrote down was that I think, just per our conversation, reverberates is in the moment when he's really like almost drowning and he has to make it back up to the chest. The line is, aided more by his terror than his strength. And I feel like that says everything, right? That the sort of like self-centered fear of loss of property, loss of face, loss of wealth is the thing that's driving him, not any kind of like moral fiber. It's all just like, how do I save myself?
Right.
And I think that like, ripples out into all of the other stories too, even though, in the Invasion from Outer Space, nobody seems particularly like terrified. they're disappointed that they're not able to be terrified, because terror is this really performative emotion, right? And I just like, I feel like that line that aided more by his terror than his strength is, I'm going to carry that with me.
Right. That I was really struck in that same vein by the idea that I would rather die than be poor. And not necessarily because this is someone who's completely lacking in kind of material security, right? You get the sense that he probably has enough to get by. He would just rather die than face that loss of status. I thought sort of the most of the fantastical reversals and changes and transformations in this story, the one that was, this exposes my own cynicism, but the hardest one to believe is that he would be a changed man, right? And and suddenly, be a sated person, and this reformed merchant. There's a good question from Chris in the comment box I just saw. You know, I think that's really interesting, Chris. And I think that.
Oh, sorry. Can I interrupt just for a second? And let's have Chris. Would you like to voice the question out loud?
I could, but I'm also aware there are a lot of hands. It looks like, and I've already spoken. So,
well, hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to you then, Chris. But Laura, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I was thinking about, Karen just brought up this idea of normalcy and disequilibrium, and living through this pandemic, I've been thinking a lot about inertia and how all of the inertia of my life has just fallen away, right? In like all these ways, I don't commute and I don't play basketball with my friends, and all of these ways that everything was just constantly moving forward because of that was how we made how human beings make meaning. And then when that inertia just again collapses, in some ways there remains normalcy and disequilibrium, right? Like I'm working, right? And I'm still working every single day, and that is so weird. And then also how there's liberation, right? Because we don't have that inertia and we're not forced to move through in this plodding way forward. And then I was thinking about how these three texts represent, or there's something, very dark here too, which is that like in this time of having no momentum, the momentum is still there in the racism, right? Like that's so obvious this week that racism perpetuates despite so much stillness. And so in each of these stories, there was these kind of like darker inertias, like the desire for wealth and greed. In Severance, there's the inertia of capitalism. And then I almost feel like in the Millhauser, there was this sense I read it with this tone, and I'm curious how other people read, but like I felt like it was like the we was like, we're on top of it, like we'll figure it out, we're monitoring the situation. And that was like maybe, or there was something so insidious about that. I'm not sure if other people felt that tone.
Jonathan, do you want to jump in while we're going down the line of hands?
Sure. I think I just wanted to add something that's sort of connected to what a lot of people are saying. That, I mean, I feel like these stories are so timeless, but there's a way in which they also feel a little bit last week or 2 weeks ago. There's this lack of collectivity and connectivity and collective action. They just all feel so lonely or individualistic. Decameron is really just this guy's own journey. Even that connection with the woman in Corfu is not a real connection. Severance kind of starts with a breakup, and there's a sense of just separating and becoming a sole agent, a solo player. And the Millhouse was so interesting because it has this we, and you think it feels collective in a way, but it's so lonely and isolated somehow. At the same time, I felt like, made me think of like a Hopper painting or Andrew Wyeth. It's got this kind of banal Americana thing, but super lonely and it just feels very disconnected, and there's that sense of isolation and powerlessness in all of these stories. So that was just a connection about disconnection that I saw in these.
Thank you. Patricia, do you want to jump in?
Get on mute. It's interesting to hear all the comments that came after I had this question. And I just wanted to share that when I first looked at the stories, I did so from crafting purposes, reading them as a writer, which I tend to do. And I love the Millhouse piece. It moves so very well. And you know, I was very fascinated by the we, and because every time I go to the store, especially when it's a Trader Joe's, they got that sign, we're all in this together, and it's painted on the window all the way across. And I keep thinking, who's this we? You know, that collective we, but who are we? We're not, there's, and so you sense that we is so fragmented, and here the irony of it appearing in this piece. And I just think it's humorous. I think it's ironic. And because especially when you get to the line where it says that it was just yellow dust. And this is what we were. We have been invaded by nothing, by emptiness. That just jumped out. And I think of our current situation, how it draws into it. And the whole first page could be now. You could be writing this now. We knew it was coming. We were ready for it. We were prepared. I remember when they told us we're going to close down the schools. I'm thinking, what? We're only going to be gone 2 weeks. Oh no, it's going to be a lot more than that, you know. But in the beginning, oh, we can do this. We've got it covered. But you know, no, we don't. And yeah, so that just jumped out, that collective we, and I still would like somebody to say, okay, who's the we? You know? Anyway. So I just wanted to share that.
Fantastic. Dorothy, jump on in.
Sorry, I was clicking the mute thing, but it wasn't working. Yeah, I was actually responding to Christopher when I raised my hand because I read his question about who is that we, and that was the first thing I thought of when Karen said one of the prompts was to write a story from the point of view of a we, and I think that I was struck by that thought too, that everyone deals with this situation so differently because not only are all our situations different, but even within my own household, there's, you know, my 2 kids and the way they're responding to this, not being able to go outside. At first, it seemed like it suited them just fine. They rarely leave their devices. And then my ex, who lives downstairs, he's just angry and trying to, you know, figure out a way that it could all be dismissed as some kind of conspiracy. And then the way I respond, you know, just trying to feed everyone and take care of everyone around me and make it as normal as possible for everyone. And we all have a similar situation, and our responses are so varied. And I feel like that we kind of has to address people's actions and people's spoken words, because you really can't imagine what people are thinking. So to speak for others as if you know what everyone's thinking. And I was actually thinking of that when I was reading the New Yorker story. I love that story, and it was so terrifying. But just the fact that, you know, the narrator first started saying we were prepared and we knew what to expect, but then later on in the piece, the narrator was saying we wanted, you know, I guess creatures with alien, you know, appearances and shooting death rays, and I thought, well, I'm sure that's not everyone. That's the narrator wanted. That was what the narrator's expectation was, because then he went from talking about what people were doing or what people perhaps all expected based on all the stories we've heard about alien invasions. It became more clear to me that that was kind of what the narrator's expectation was. So I guess when Christopher asked, who should that we include, you know, I think that if you're trying to speak for everyone, it's almost, impossible. The only thing you can do is when they, like who was it who was talking about Trader Joe's and we're all in this together, because that is a fact. We are all, but we're not all going to respond the same way. And so I don't know, how do you write a story from that perspective? I know I wrote one for my fiction writing class that I wrote this past semester, and I kind of talked about some friends, like it was but it was more about their actions. It was written from a first person narrator, but it was really kind of addressing what they did, I'm not sure if you could possibly have a collective narrator that talks about how everyone feels or thinks. That's just what was going on in my mind when I read Christopher's story, Christopher's question, actually. That's it.
Yeah, Thomas. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say really quickly, because a few of you mentioned St. Lucy's, and that story is about a group of wolf girls. It's like a pack, and they start off as this we. And when I was writing, it splinters, and sort of, I hope slyly as the story continues, the baton gets passed to this I. And that to me was some of the violence of what happens to these girls, is that they start off as a true collective. They dream the same dreams, they sleep on the same red screen. And by the end of the story, human values have invaded this child, and she's lying, she's looking out for number one, and so I was thinking a little bit also about Julia Otsuka wrote this beautiful novel that I can recommend to you guys, where it's Japanese immigrants, and one by one, you watch this we kind of fracture, it comes back together, it changes composition. So I think it's interesting to watch how other writers approach that question, and it is a good one though, right? To be aware that, of course, a single author is, never gonna speak for the entire polity, and that it is a question. It is political. It is a question about sort of power and who gets to speak for whom.
Thomas, I think we've got time for one more thought or question. If you'd like to jump in.
Well, I shudder to think that I'll have the closing word here. And this goes back to something that was said earlier, and I'm afraid I don't remember who added this, but they brought up the question of all these stories prompt questions of why is this happening, and this is not a critique of that point, but I almost think that it almost begs the question a little bit. And to me, all of these are stories of a crisis, and of a crisis so great that it really does shake the foundations of knowledge and of what we know as human beings, and what the limits are of our understanding. And that can go to, a matter of science, as we see in coronavirus and in the alien invasion story, but it can be also about ourselves and our identity. You see that in the Decameron, his status is thrown, completely out of the usual orbit by his loss, and in Severance, her job, her relationship, all these things are completely annihilated, or maybe that's where things are going. I haven't read the whole book, but in any case, and I feel this myself, is that we are you never know what you know, or that we construct these very fragile edifices for ourselves, and in these moments when that's shaken, we see how fragile they are.
Karen, I'm afraid we're nearing the end of our time together for today. So I'm wondering if we should turn to the writing for Thursday, and then we can talk just a little bit about the structure of Thursday before we close for today.
Sure thing. Um, so I was gonna send you guys away with 2 prompts, and I'll send these to Renee to email to you guys also, so you know. But the first is a story, short story. You know, try to keep it to 2-3 pages as Millhauser does, told from the first person plural. And feel free to, you know, think about some of these questions that have come up, right? Is there a way to underscore, ironically or otherwise, that there's many diverse actors inside the suite? You know, the Trader Joe's, we're all in this together, right? Well, is there a way to show that the composition of the we, it's, you know, it's people who have the luxury to stay at home, you know, the cashiers at the Trader Joe's, bus drivers, you know, people, unsheltered people without access to clean water, you know, that everyone is in this we. So I think that's an interesting challenge a little bit. Sort of, are there ways to reveal to your reader where there is a common denominator, right? Everybody's mortal. Everybody, you know, there's an invisible enemy maybe, or you'll think of. I mean, you might even want to write about nonfiction about what's happening in the streets of New York, if that's feeling more urgent to you. But from the first person plural and see what that yields. So a first person plural story. I was thinking that they have to assimilate some new reality, right? Something changes overnight, and it can be. I mean, if you're really feeling tapped out on this bleakness, I think it can also be light. You know, maybe it's like all the children grow green wings or something. I don't know, but you know, it doesn't have to be. It can tonally, it can land wherever you guys need it to. And then the other option, do both if you want, is to tell a Decameron tale about this 2020 pandemic, where the pandemic is just sort of in the background. It's not maybe the focal point of your story. And I would love if that there you could pick from any of the prompts. So just, you know, you can go there. There are 10 days of stories. Some are, you know, love affairs that end badly, like Lady Gaga, Bad Romances. You know, tricks that partners play on one another. The clergy comes off really poorly in this book. So you'll go and look at the prompts. But the one that I really have been interested in right now are misadventures that end happily. I think that's a secret human genre that doesn't get enough airtime. I think there's sort of I've internalized this sense anyway, that serious fiction never has anything resembling a happy ending, that's always like sentimental garbage, you know? So I'm just interested, is that really true? And can you have a plausibly, if not like happy, you know, like Care Bear Stare happy, like can you have a plausibly uplifting ending that maybe the characters don't even deserve, right? People suffer undeservedly all the time. So can there be an ending like Landolfo's? So there you go. 2 options: Decameron tale, answering one of the prompts, maybe misadventures that end happily, or, you know, surprising happy ending, or a first person plural story about the length of the Millhauser. And let's try to keep these short-ish.
It's obvious, Karen, that you have been reading a lot of children's books lately. Misadventures that end happily. And
yes, you know, can I tell you guys really quickly? Sam and I were at the Coleman Center with Nicole Krauss, who's a very wonderful writer. She told me that she read her children the Metamorphosis, like the, you know, Kafka's Metamorphosis, not any kind of abridged edition. And I guess her son just couldn't stop laughing, and he was like, "Mama, it doesn't have a happy ending." Which I really love.
Oh, that's fantastic. So to recap a little bit about, so I will send you those prompts in written form. And just so you're all, it sounds like the stakes are very high now, because those are great prompts, and this is a very rich world we live in to bounce off of. So know that when we come back together on Thursday, we'll ask everyone to read for no more than 2 minutes. So every person in the group will have 5 minutes total. 2 of which during 2 of which they will read, and 3 minutes then for feedback. 5 of you will be able to read to the whole group, so your 5 minutes will take place in the full group, and the rest of you will share in small groups. So everybody will have that total 5 minutes, 2 of which for reading, 3 of which for feedback, and and 5 of you will do that in the full group. The rest of you will do your reading and get your feedback in small groups.
And a few of you in small groups, maybe you were going here, Renee, but a few of you in the small groups will have the pleasure of having Karen, who will be skipping from group to group and for one story a piece. So
exactly,
we've tried to serve many masters here, and 2 minutes is not a very long time to read. If you want to read a complete story in that time, it's certainly possible to do so. But you're going to have to be very brief in your story. But we're only going to be able to hear 2 minutes of it. That's just this is all an experiment. This is our first creative writing masterclass, and so maybe we'll decide to you guys can extend it and live on yourselves and work together as a writing group, or just work on these stories together. We'll do the best we can to facilitate that, but this is the result of a lot of discussion and back and forth on our parts to figure out the best way to be fair to everyone and to give everyone a chance.
Yeah. And just one last very quick point. We are going to ask those of you who possibly can do it to submit your stories to a folder by noon on Thursday. And that will give us a chance to have the stories in front of us as you read, which I think will really facilitate feedback. And Kalia, I was wondering if you had a question about the prompts. I noticed your hand was up there for just a moment.
No, my question was not that I expect to be done that quickly, but if we were finished early, should we just send it out to everybody? But the folder sounds like a much tidier way to do that.
The folder will be great. That's a great question. Thanks very much. All right. Well, with that,
jump in once again, Renee, just to say that you have 2 days. Nobody's expecting, let's lower the bar here a little bit.
I am.
Huh?
I'm going to write a story about an evil instructor who steals all the great ideas of teachers.
Okay. Yeah, Karen, give them a little encouragement and lower the bar for them a little bit.
Yeah, I think we all, I'll be so amazed. I mean, especially I know some of you guys sounds like have young children at home. If we could just write grammatical sentences, I'm going to call it a win.
I love grammatical sentences. That would be awesome. All right.
And Amber, I'm going to save the chat and maybe we can, I see we've got some great questions that we didn't get to in the group chat. So maybe we can
continue for a little bit if people like. If you have to check out, thanks for being here. Thanks for teaching. Thanks for living through this so strongly for your students.